presentation today, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Clarke to kick things off with her team.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric, and thanks for inviting us. And particularly thanks everyone for coming. I recognize some of your names, and the rest of you I'm really pleased to meet. So Ying and Sam, do you want to turn your videos on as well? Excellent. So I'm just going to start with a quick land acknowledgement. I live and work in Waterloo, which is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Attawaddaran, and Anishinaabe peoples. And we're quite committed to, at the University of Waterloo, to reconciliation and also to indigenization. So I wanted to start quickly with that land acknowledgement. I'll also say as an aside, we've also committed to carbon neutrality at the university and have put together our plan for how the university will reach that, particularly scope 1 and 2, but we also have some scope 3 in the university's plan. But that is an aside and a story for another day. Today, I'm here to talk to you about our research, which is on deep decarbonization at the local level. You've heard already, I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo, and stay there. With me is Ying Zhou. Now, Ying is a PhD student working in my research team, and her research in particular has been looking at the current state of deep decarbonization planning at the local level in Canada, and that work's being done with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Sam, who's going to carry the presentation today, Samantha Linton, is a recent master's student, and her research is on those inspiring best practice cases from around the world of cities who've not only committed to deep decarbonization, but are well on the way to achieving carbon neutrality in their cities, or at least an 80% reduction. So we're going to hear about those stories today. Now, Sam. And I'll get into more detail. We have about an hour for this, and we have about 35 minutes of content, including 3 polls. So we'll pause at a few points to do some Zoom polls with you, just to hear where you're at with this various content. And then at the end, we should have about 20 minutes for questions. So if you can hold your questions to the end, though, you're welcome to put them in the chat in advance, and Eric's going to moderate the Q&A at the very end. All right, so what are we talking about? Well, I'll introduce the research I'm working on briefly. Then Ying will do that Canadian overview very quickly. And then the majority of the presentation will be Samantha speaking, and she'll talk about what is deep decarbonization. She'll introduce her master's thesis and get into what are the technical pathways being used by these best practice cities, what strategies are being used, what governance arrangements are being used. And then we'll end with some of the key findings and where we go for there. At the end, this has been, you can flip. This has been a research area for me now for over 15 years. So I've been looking at, and some of you'll know me from this, sustainable community plans and how municipalities, both corporate and community-wide, can implement those plans. In particular, I've focused on the community-wide and how to engage partners and what the governance arrangement should look at. So then in the last 6 years or so, I've been looking specifically at climate mitigation plans. And in the last couple of years now at the deep decarbonization ones, the ones that are really aiming for at least an 80% reduction, or carbon neutrality by at least 2050. And how are we actually going to achieve that? So my research focuses on the implementation side of this. And what are the strategies, what are the governance arrangements, and how are we going to get the other partners involved? So today you're going to hear a bit of that, especially the exciting stories that Sam will share. But I'm also starting to think about what's next in terms of my research and what would be most useful to you, because I'm only interested in doing research that's going to be helpful to practice. And where I think I'm going to go next is to take a deep dive in a few cities and really study kind of what are you doing to implement, who's involved internally, who's involved externally, how is all of that working, and what have the barriers you're experiencing, so that we can share that more broadly. So if anyone on this call is interested in the future of working with me on research, let me know afterwards, because I'm really setting up kind of what's my next 5 years of research in this space going to be. Okay, Sam? These days I'm positioning everything in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm wearing my pin today, and really our research contributes to 3 of the goals. Number 11 on sustainable cities and communities, number 13 on climate action, and number 17 on partnerships for the goals. So I'll end there and turn it over to Ying, but you'll hear from me again at the end. And again, thanks for coming to this.
Thank you, Amelia. So in partnership with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, we had the opportunity to interview 51 Canadian cities across these 9 different provinces. You can see the number of municipalities interviewed and the provinces. And they range from 500 in population to over 3 million. So you can see that size variation of these different Canadian cities as well. Sam, can you flip? From the introduction, we have heard from some of you on the stages. You're currently in the planning stages and the target you're working with, and you probably see similarities here. So of the cities as interviewed, most of them are still at the final stage of planning and creating their decarbonization plans, and few have started moving toward this implementation stage. And they're also working with 80% GHG reduction by 2050, and more of them are switching over to that carbon neutrality targets as well. There are some slight differences between larger municipality compared to smaller municipality in terms of their focus of their pathways. Mid-sized to large municipalities tend to focus more on buildings, public active transportation planning, infrastructures, because that's where the bulk of their emission is, and where small and rural municipalities sees more opportunities in waste and electricity, so moving toward that renewable or less energy resources with less GHG emissions. And in terms of governance strategies, here are just the sum of the few. So citizen and stakeholder engagement to improve climate literacy, bylaws, policy tools to promote behavior change. Some are having that holistic alignment with economic development, so looking at the green economy strategies incorporated in there. And some municipalities are taking a more innovative approach, so looking at that entrepreneur investment model in decarbonization. And this is just a snapshot. Sam will go into more details on these governance strategies as well as the governance structure. But to summarize, of these municipalities that's interviewed, yearly the governance structure falls into one of these 3 major categories. Either it's municipal control and led, where the city, the local government takes ownership and lead most of these actions, or it's a shared partnership. And as well as there's sometimes the third-party organization, that partner organization takes the lead, while the cities and the local government plays a more minor and supporting role in terms of this implementation and carry out these decarbonization actions. And lastly, just to name a few, there's obviously barriers. So in implementing a climate lens throughout the organization, so aligning that vision with the various day-to-day priorities and activities and different departmental priorities has also been a challenge. Also financing, so ensuring the financial continuity of some of these actions has been on top of mind for a lot of Canadian cities. And lastly, for smaller and rural municipalities, one of the challenge and barrier is that staff capacity and the resources. So here's just a brief summary of the current state for decarbonization in Canada.
Great, thank you, Ying and Amelia. Good morning, everyone. So now I'm going to switch it over and talk about my master's research project, which was called Pathways to Deep Decarbonization at the Local Level. So Deep decarbonization is defined as a complete societal shift away from fossil fuels. It's really a transformation that is aimed to break carbon lock-in, rather than the small incremental approach towards mitigation that a lot of cities and anyone in general has done in the past. So at the local level, some of the key elements of deep decarbonization are firstly having a clear vision and very ambitious targets, as well as a well thought out and backcasted implementation plan. And as I mentioned, this implementation plan has to address breaking carbon lock-in, as well as the societal and technological transformation. And it's also very important to address environmental and social justice to ensure that no one gets left behind in deep decarbonization processes. So for my specific study, what I did is I took 8 case studies, 4 of them Canadian cities, 4 corresponding international cities. And I reviewed their plans and basically all the public documents that were available. And I asked kind of 3 different research questions having to do with the technical pathways, the strategies, and the governance structures that all of these cities are using and implementing to reach their deep decarbonization targets. So the Canadian cities that I chose were the town of Bridgewater, Guelph, Vancouver, and Toronto. And then based off of these, I chose corresponding international cities or towns that have equally ambitious or more ambitious targets, as well as similar population sizes and demographics, so that they could be somewhat comparable. So the international cases that I chose were Park City, Utah, Lahti, Finland, Oslo, Norway, and New York City. So as we can see here, they range from very small towns to extremely large cities, and they all have very ambitious long-term deep decarbonization targets. So here is just an example of each of the case studies emissions by sector. We can see that there are 4 main priority sectors for emissions and that need to be decarbonized. And these are just what I was able to find that are publicly available based off of recent GHG inventories for each of the cities. We can see that some of them do group electricity and buildings together, but I think the important message here is that buildings and transportation are the 2 largest sectors for emissions and as well for decarbonization at the local level. So my first research question is, what are the technical pathways that are being developed in cities? So as I mentioned in the slide above, there are 4 priority sectors for decarbonization, which are electricity, which can be done through increasing renewable energy in the electricity grid. Buildings is the second, and this is, there are existing buildings and new buildings. Existing buildings need to be targeted for retrofitting and increased energy efficiency, while new buildings need to be built to zero emission building standards. Next, we have transportation. This is addressed through mode shift, which refers to shifting from personal vehicles to active transit and public transit. And we have fuel shift, which refers to switching from a combustion engine to electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. Lastly, we have waste, which is a much smaller sector, as we saw above, but this still needs to be addressed, and this can be done through eliminating waste going to landfills, as well as developing waste to energy systems and capturing remaining gases that come from landfills. Next, we have carbon sinks and offsetting, which is not for a priority sector for decarbonization, but rather the opposite. So once a local government or a city has eliminated as many emissions they can from the 4 priority sectors, we can look to carbon sinks and offsets to offset those remaining emissions. And that can be done through increasing the local capacity of sinks and or purchasing carbon offsets. Through this study, we also found that there are a few other emerging areas, and this mainly has to do with scope 3 emissions, which occur outside the geographical boundary of a city. And this is mainly in the embodied emissions of construction materials and food choices and just other consumer goods that we import into our cities. So for each category, as you can see here, I have electricity. So for each category, the results were collected. And what I did was I developed it into other categories of the types of actions that I see the cities are doing. And then also for this presentation, I've chosen one sort of best practice example to share with you guys, just to get a little inspiration. And well, it's important to mention that for each category, there's definitely more than one best practice example, but for time, we'll stick to this. So for example, for electricity, the types of actions that are the most common and that I found through my case studies are cities are building more renewable electricity capacity within their grids. They're investing in building district heating networks, as well as looking into building scale energy systems. And then on this side, we can see that these are the cities that I found that are either already doing this or looking to do this in the future. So for the best practice, today this one comes from Park City, Utah. So Park City, Utah is a very small town. And then what they did was they partnered with their local utility called Rocky Mountain Power. So this partnership, through it, they were able to lobby the state government and pass legislation at the state level that allows communities in Utah to have 100% renewable energy. So once this legislation was passed, they began constructing a renewable energy plant that by the year 2030 will provide 100% renewable energy for the entire community. So next, as I mentioned, buildings is the second sector, and it is divided into existing buildings and new buildings. So for existing buildings, retrofitting is the course of action. And on the left, we can see the types of actions that were found, all kind of having to do with influencing and incentivizing residents to retrofit buildings. And we also have examples of cities that are retrofitting their own buildings. A best practice of this is New York City. Fortunately for them, they have the legal jurisdiction to pass mandates and laws. So Local Law 97 was passed, which places a cap on GHG emissions per building. So by the year 2050, all large buildings in the city will have to reduce their emissions by 80%. Next, we have new buildings. And once again, some of the types of results we found were that, for example, Vancouver and New York have the legal jurisdiction to actually implement and enact their own building codes, whereas other cities don't necessarily have that power. They are opting to have more voluntary building codes and performance standards and stretch codes. We also see examples of cities enacting their own city-owned building codes and putting regulations on heating systems. So once again, the city of Vancouver is a best practice case. They are fortunate enough to have the legal jurisdiction to enact their own building code, but this is a best case example just because they jumped on this strategy and they took advantage of it. It's also important to mention that their strategy in Vancouver includes an embodied emissions reduction strategy, which is one of those emerging areas I talked about before. Next, we have transportation. And the first part of transportation is mode shift. So through my research, I found that all of the case studies are investing in infrastructure related to transportation mode shifts. So whether that's in public transit or bike lanes or better sidewalks, etc. We also see that some cities are thinking and have already done implementing restricted vehicle zones throughout the cities. And we also see that some of them are using different financial tools and market-based instruments to help influence their residents to shift their modes of transportation. A really good example of this comes from Finland. The city of Lahti, they partnered with their local university and developed what they call the City Cap program. So this is a personal cap and trade system that rewards their residents when they choose to use active or public transit. And the rewards are small, but they've had really good success with this so far. Next, we have transportation fuel shift. So this has to do with investing in electric public transit and electric fleets. We see that all of the cities that I looked at are doing this so far. We also are looking at investing in EV charging infrastructure throughout the city, And also some of them are providing financial incentives as well as regulations. The best practice example of this is the city of Oslo, which has a series of toll rings throughout the city. And they put a price on roads, and these tolls have emissions-based pricing. So for example, electric vehicles pay less at these tolls than any combustion engine vehicle. So next we have waste, which, as I mentioned before, is a much smaller sector for decarbonization, but still no less important. I found 3 different types of actions that the cities are doing. This has to do with capturing the landfill gases that already exist, developing different waste to energy systems, and then enabling and supporting activities, which is more just about awareness raising and education to decrease waste. The city of Oslo has a really interesting case. So the city, they depend a lot on waste incineration for district heating in their downtown network. But last year, they finally finished the construction of a one-of-a-kind carbon capture and storage system for this incinerator, which actually will reduce their community-wide emissions by up to 15% for one incineration plant. So this one carbon capture storage system has a huge impact, and they're looking to kind of share this practice and this knowledge with other cities. And finally, we have carbon sinks and offsets, which I mentioned before, which the 2 types of actions that cities can go ahead with is increasing the local carbon sink capacity and or purchasing carbon offsets. Some of the best practice examples I looked at, there are 2. They're quite similar, both Lahti and Park City. They've mapped their carbon sinks, and they've developed these long-term strategies to really increase these their local carbon sinks through a bunch of different methods. Lahti is interesting because they're looking into changing their building practices to include more wood in building, which will make buildings actually themselves a carbon sink. Park City has also developed and sold these open space bonds, which protects local land and increase the local carbon sinks. Great, so I'm going to get back into it. My second research question had to do with what different types of tools and strategies that local governments are developing and using for the implementation of their plans. So this was divided into 4 different categories, the first being engagement. So I really wanted to know who the local government is engaging and how are they doing it. Next, I looked at the different policy tools. So what types of different plans and programs the cities are using, whether or not they're implementing bylaws, and whether or not they have different types of standards and building codes that they're implementing. Next, I looked at financial tools. One of these is in terms of infrastructure investments. So what are the cities investing in to help implement their plans? Whether or not market-based instruments are being used to influence behavior, and whether or not perverse incentives are being removed. So the removal of incentives to use anything that causes emissions. And then lastly, I looked at what I call the green economy. So whether or not the city is looking at these climate action plans as investment strategies, whether or not they're changing their procurement policies, whether or not they're trying to develop and train a local workforce and really develop a green local economy. So for engagement, which stakeholder engagement, I looked at these 4 different categories. So whether or not during the planning phase, the city is engaging external stakeholders. And then during the implementation phase. So when I say during implementation phase, I really mean whether or not the stakeholders are actively involved in the implementation of the actions. Whereas the planning phase is more of a consulting process. Next, I looked at whether or not they're engaging technical experts to kind of back up their plans and make sure that they're feasible. And then another form of engagement I looked at is the use of transnational city networks, like Quest, basically just city networks where different representatives can get together and share stories and learn from each other. So engagement best practices, I have two here. The first being Lati. So this city, it's not necessarily for their climate action plan, but they've developed what they call the Peruka app, which is an engagement tool that the city uses to connect with their residents very quickly. It's a mobile application that residents have on their phone, and the city can send out alerts, quizzes, surveys, etc., where they can get real-time responses. And the second best practice example we have is the city of Guelph, where our NAG Guelph, which I believe Alex is here today, they engage local stakeholders in all phases of the planning process and the implementation, which not all cities do. They don't necessarily give external stakeholders decision-making power. So next I looked at the green economy. So first, whether or not the cities are greening procurement policies. Next, I looked at whether or not a green economy was considered a co-benefit of the climate action plan. And then really whether or not they're targeting green businesses heavily. And then lastly, I looked at training local workforce. So this, the best practice case comes from this training of the local workforce. Both Vancouver and New York have partnered with technical schools and colleges to train construction workers and students on, especially when it comes to construction, zero emission building practices, so that when these their building mandates come into effect, they will have the workforce who's ready to meet the demand. Next, I looked at policy tools. So the first one, self-regulation. That refers to whether or not the city has a corporate climate action plan. So whether or not they're regulating their own corporate emissions, and they have kind of corporate policies. Next, I looked at whether or not they have command and control regulations, which once again goes back to not all of the cities have the legal jurisdiction to implement a lot of these command and control regulations. And then voluntary actions is just kind of different policies, and a climate action plan itself is a voluntary action in that it is a policy tool that the cities are using. So for best practice examples, once again, we have New York City. In 2019, they adopted the Climate Mobilization Act, which is the largest climate solution put forth by any city in the world. It has kind of wide sweeping different local laws. One of them I mentioned before, and it really has to do with the building sector and reducing emissions from that. We also have Vancouver and their zero emission buildings plan, which I mentioned as well before, and their regulations and their mandates to have all new buildings to be zero emissions by the year 2030. Lastly, I looked at different financial tools. As I mentioned, infrastructure investments are a financial tool that cities can use to influence resident behavior. Market-based instruments can also be used, as well as providing financial incentives. Divesting from pension funds is starting to be, other cities are starting to look at this as well, but it's also a financial tool that a few of them are using to be able to divest from fossil fuels and then reinvest in local climate action. So Park City, they don't have really wide sweeping financial tools, but they've used a series of smaller ones to help influence the residents' behavior, especially in the transportation sector. So what they've done is they offer free EV charging for anyone in the city. They've removed free parking from the downtown area, as well as they've given access to free public transit for anyone in the city. My last research question had to do with the governance structures that are being developed and being used to implement these climate action plans. I mostly looked at governance structures within local government. So the first category I looked at was coordination. So this really refers to internal coordination. So how the local government is structured and whether and how the city, all the relevant city departments work together. Next, I looked at oversight and reporting. So how often progress is reported on and who is the overseeing body of this climate action plan. I also looked at cross-sector collaboration. So how or if they're leveraging partnerships to help with implementation and who they're partnering with. I also looked at multi-level integration. This refers to how the city's climate action plan integrates with climate action plans or the lack thereof of governments at the provincial or federal level. And lastly, I looked at different funding mechanisms that are being used or to basically raise money and pay for these climate action plans. So the first category I looked at is coordination. So I looked to see whether or not there was a centralized sustainability department within each local government. And then I also looked to see is how whether or not there's cross-departmental collaboration, whether or not they all work together, or whether the sustainability department kind of acts as the coordinator itself. I also looked to see whether or not what I call a climate lens is instilled within each relevant city department. And then lastly, we have the example of Guelph, where a multi-stakeholder entity co-leads coordination with the local government itself. So I have a couple of best practice examples of this. For example, Oslo, Norway, they have what they call the climate budget. And this is the result of a coordination between the city's climate agency and the finance department. So this is a really good example of cross-departmental coordination for the implementation of their climate budget. Vancouver is also a great example because out of their 10 main goals, each goal belongs to the relevant department. They have like direct ownership over their specific goal. Next, I looked at oversight and reporting. So whether or not there's a regular interval reporting system and whether or not there is an overseeing board or council that kind of makes sure that everything is done according to plan, which of course all of these cases do have. But there are kind of there's big differences within each case. For example, some of the cities report quarterly, whereas others, it's kind of every 2 years. So yeah, there's big differences. A best practice example is the city of Oslo, where they have their carbon budget, which is reported annually, but they also have their climate barometer, which is a set of 14 different indicators that are monitored constantly and reported on quarterly. And their carbon budget is a mechanism that is run by the city's financial department, where they, quote, count GHG emissions the way they count money. So next I looked at cross-sector collaboration, which refers to collaboration with kind of external stakeholders. So all of the cities I looked at do engage different partners, and then whether or not they engage a large kind of partnership, cross-sector social partnership. Guelph is a great example of this, where Our Energy Guelph, they really leverage their cross-sector collaboration and give many different community stakeholders actual decision-making power through their board of directors. Next, I looked at multi-level integration. So whether or not there's kind of two-way integration between the policies at the local level and much higher. It's interesting, both of my American cases had to take more of a bottom-up approach towards this because their federal and state governments weren't necessarily supportive of climate action. So Park City is a great example of this. They lobbied their state government and were able to help pass the Community Climate or Community Renewable Energy Act, which allows any community in Utah now to opt to have 100% renewable energy. And lastly, I looked at different types of funding mechanisms, because of course, climate action planning and implementation does require lots of funding. Tax revenues and city budgets were the main source, as well as funding from higher levels of government. Some of the other cities do leverage partnerships and private sector investment to help pay for different climate actions. And I also found that some cities are really developing these innovative funding mechanisms to help pay for things. These are all, as I mentioned, best practice examples that I looked at, but none of them are necessarily perfect and much more work still needs to be done. A few kind of key findings from my research is that while support from higher levels of government does play a really key role, and it's very important, I've seen examples of cities that have been quite successful without that support. Small cities, another finding is small cities and towns have the ability to move really quickly once they commit to climate action, especially when they leverage cross-sector partnerships. Transnational networks, so city networks are very important when it comes to learning, sharing stories. Adopting a climate lens within each city department is very key to the success of any climate action. And lastly, emerging areas such as Scope 3 emissions and consumption-based inventories must become the new norm in deep decarbonization planning. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Amelia. Thank you for your time and for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Super, thanks, Sam. So I hope you found something in there that's inspiring for everyone who was listening and maybe a few different ideas. This, we do have our webpage up where you can find different research. Also, Sam's thesis is publicly available with each of these cases in detail. And we've had one academic publication so far that you can find some of this in. And I'm happy to share the slides as well, though this presentation has been recorded, so you could go back to sections of it if it was of interest to you. I'll end there, but just to say that if you are interested in talking to me more about future research, please do follow up directly with me afterwards.